Every time prices climb, you lose a little more control over your life, your rent, your groceries, your gas tank. Month after month, they all edge higher. And if you've ever wondered why your salary just doesn't go as far as it used to, you're not crazy. You're witnessing the most invisible wealth transfer in modern times, one that happens every single generation. Because inflation isn't just about rising prices, it's about restructuring who gets to build wealth. Welcome to the empire of finance where money, power, and history intersect, and nothing is as straightforward as it appears. To most people, inflation looks like disorder. Prices spiraling, savings shrinking, everything falling apart. But to those who understand the system, inflation is structure. It's the mechanism that keeps the modern economy functioning. It's how governments finance wars without new taxes. It's how corporations eliminate their obligations. And it's how the wealthy multiply their fortunes while everyone else struggles to stay in place. So the real question isn't why inflation exists. It's why we allow it to persist, cycle after cycle. To answer that, we need to go back to an era when inflation was treated like a crisis, not a policy goal. To most people, inflation looks like disorder. Prices spiraling, savings shrinking, everything falling apart. But to those who understand the system, inflation is structure. It's the mechanism that keeps the modern economy functioning. It's how governments finance wars without new taxes. It's how corporations eliminate their obligations. And it's how the wealthy multiply their fortunes while everyone else struggles to stay in place. So the real question isn't why inflation exists. It's why we allow it to persist, cycle after cycle. To answer that, we need to go back to an era when inflation was treated like a crisis, not a policy goal. By the end of World War II, inflation had shifted from something feared to something useful. Governments emerged from the war drowning in debt. Some nations owed more than double their entire economic output. They couldn't repay it through traditional means. So they chose a different path. They let inflation do the heavy lifting. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, global debt quietly diminished. Not because economies boomed, but because the real value of that debt evaporated. $1 trillion in war bonds didn't mean the same thing a decade later. The system discovered something powerful. Controlled inflation could solve impossible financial problems without anyone really noticing. Then came 1971. President Nixon severed the dollar's connection to gold. What was announced as a temporary measure became permanent. And in that moment, money stopped being a fixed measure of value. It became a tool of management. For the first time in modern history, the world's reserve currency wasn't backed by a physical commodity, but by trust alone. You couldn't trade it for gold anymore, only for more paper. Inflation was no longer a side effect. It was built into the blueprint. From that point forward, everything changed. Money could be created in unlimited amounts as long as confidence held. Governments could borrow without clear boundaries. Banks could expand credit indefinitely. And those who understood the game learned that in a world of managed inflation, the winners weren't the savers, they were the borrowers. Because inflation fundamentally reverses the logic of money. If you hold cash, inflation diminishes it. If you hold debt, inflation works in your favor. Every year that prices increase, the real burden of what you owe decreases. $1 million mortgage today might feel overwhelming, but in 2 decades and after consistent inflation, that same obligation feels manageable. Meanwhile, your assets, your property, your stocks, your investments, all increase in nominal terms. Inflation doesn't just reduce debt, it multiplies wealth. That's the contradiction at the system's core. The same mechanism that erodes working-class purchasing power sustains the wealthy. And it's not some hidden conspiracy. It's simple mathematics. Inflation is what allows a debt-dependent economy to function. Without it, every dollar borrowed would need to be repaid with dollars that hold the same purchasing power, an impossible standard when the entire structure depends on credit expansion. So governments, central banks, and major corporations reached an unspoken understanding. Better to let the currency lose value gradually than let the system implode. But what about ordinary people in this arrangement? The answer is straightforward and brutal. Wages rarely keep pace. Prices outrun paychecks. Savings, once the foundation of middle-class stability, become a slow leak. And those who can't afford to own assets, who depend on earned income rather than investments, find themselves on an invisible treadmill that accelerates endlessly because inflation rewards ownership, not labor, and it penalizes caution. It transforms saving, traditionally considered a virtue, into a losing strategy. The system encourages you to save, but punishes you for actually doing it. When your bank pays you 3% interest but inflation runs at 6%, you're not gaining. You're paying a fee to keep your money motionless. Meanwhile, people who borrow at 4% to purchase real estate watch their asset values climb by double digits. That's not good fortune. That's the design. Inflation doesn't redistribute wealth randomly. It redistributes it systematically upward. Those closest to the source of new money, financial institutions, governments, large corporations, receive it first, while it still carries full value. By the time it reaches average workers, it's already been diluted. This is called the Cantillon effect, named after an 18th century economist who identified this pattern 300 years ago. When fresh money enters circulation, it advantages whoever accesses it earliest, before prices adjust throughout the economy. In his era, that meant royalty and merchants. Today, it means institutional investors and central banks. Inflation doesn't just alter prices, it determines who gets to live above them. After 1971, the fundamental nature of money permanently shifted. What once discouraged overspending now encouraged it. What once restrained governments now freed them. And as credit replaced savings as the economic engine, inflation became the invisible adhesive holding everything together. By the 1980s and 1990s, the system had achieved a delicate equilibrium. Central banks committed to price stability, targeting roughly 2% inflation, just enough to keep the economy expanding without the public recognizing the hidden cost. 2% sounds innocuous, almost technical, but over 30 years it cuts a dollar's purchasing power in half. The crucial difference, while ordinary families watch their grocery costs double, the wealthy watch their asset portfolios double and more. Because when inflation remains predictable, debt becomes manageable. And the wealthy don't fear inflation, they harness it. They own the properties that appreciate, the companies that raise prices, the securities that adjust upward. They hold the debt that becomes cheaper to service every year. Inflation is their silent partner, an invisible ally that magnifies every advantage. Then in 2020, the pattern repeated, this time during a global pandemic. Governments injected money directly into households to prevent economic collapse. Demand exploded while supply chains fractured. Inflation surged to levels not seen in 4 decades. And once again, history echoed. Stock markets reached unprecedented highs. Housing became unattainable for many. And the same people who had benefited from low interest rates now profited from scarcity itself. For a brief moment, the public blamed corporate greed for inflation. But that wasn't new greed. It was the same greed the system had rewarded for generations. They had simply mastered the game. Because inflation doesn't select its winners. It merely amplifies whoever already possesses leverage. Examine any major inflationary period throughout history, and you'll find the same pattern. In Weimar Germany, the middle class was wiped out, while industrialists holding tangible assets emerged wealthier than before. In post-war Britain, inflation quietly erased the national debt while savers watched their pensions dissolve. In the 1970s America, stocks stagnated, but real estate and commodities generated fortunes for those who could access them. And in the 2020s, the wealthiest 1% accumulated trillions, while median households lost ground. Different times, identical formula. Inflation is humanity's oldest wealth transfer, and the most socially acceptable one. The public blames greed, politicians, supply disruptions. But those are surface-level explanations. The underlying cause is structural. We've constructed an economy that requires credit expansion, and credit expansion demands inflation to survive. The alternative isn't stability, it's systemic failure. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis should have forced a reckoning, an opportunity to rebuild something more equitable. Instead, it became a demonstration in controlled inflation. Central banks created trillions in new currency to rescue the system. Not by distributing it to citizens, but by channeling it into banks and financial markets. Asset prices recovered almost immediately. Stocks and real estate soared. Wages remained stagnant. Quantitative easing, the technical terminology for money creation through bond purchases, made it sound like a surgical intervention. It wasn't. It was a historic redistribution of wealth through asset inflation. Those who owned assets flourished. Those who didn't waited. It wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. It was policy. Governments benefit enormously too. Public debt shrinks in real terms the longer inflation persists. That's why they'll combat deflation with every available tool. Deflation reveals weakness. It makes debt burdensome, exposes financial bubbles, triggers defaults. Inflation does the opposite. It conceals problems, smooths over gaps, and quietly shifts hardship downward through society. And the banking sector? They benefit most of all, because inflation guarantees a world that must continuously borrow. If prices constantly rise, saving becomes irrational. You must invest. You must pursue returns. And every pursuit means another loan, another financial product, another complex instrument. The entire architecture of contemporary finance, from home loans to corporate bonds to stock repurchases, depends on the assumption that future money will be worth slightly less than present money. The problem is, the lower you sit in this hierarchy, the less control you have. When you depend on wages, your income adjusts slower than inflation. When you depend on assets, your wealth adjusts faster. And when you depend on debt, inflation either destroys you or enriches you, depending entirely on what type of debt you carry. Credit card debt is toxic. A fixed-rate mortgage is leverage. The wealthy understand this distinction. Most people don't. That's how inflation transforms knowledge itself into capital. Because inflation is not random. It's how power measures time itself. It rewards those who live in the future, the ones who borrow, invest, and manipulate credit flows. It punishes those who live in the present, the ones who earn, save, and spend what they possess. And it forgets those who live in the past, the ones who still believe money retains its value. That's why the wealthy embrace inflation, and you fear it, because to them it's not theft, it's technique. Every generation learns the same painful lesson. The value of currency is never permanent. The only question is whether you're the one losing value or the one determining what value means. That's why even when central banks claim to be fighting inflation, their genuine objective is never elimination, only management. To make it feel like stability while the currency quietly loses value beneath everyone's feet. Because if inflation truly reached zero, economic growth would halt. The machine would stop. So the war on inflation becomes theater, a careful performance between credibility and necessity. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates, markets react, and then, just before something critical breaks, policy reverses. Because everyone at the top understands, a little inflation is an acceptable cost for maintaining the illusion. Inflation isn't a malfunction in capitalism, it is capitalism, operating at maximum velocity, climbing uphill with your purchasing power in its possession. Because ultimately, inflation is not the flame. It's the oxygen. And the world we've built cannot survive without it. If this changed how you see the economy, hit subscribe. History holds the answers, and I'll show you exactly where to find them. But there's something deeper than policy at work here. Something psychological. Inflation doesn't just change numbers. It changes human behavior. It conditions people to consume immediately rather than plan for later. It punishes patience. It rewards speculation. It turns saving into anxiety and risk-taking into hope. In doing so, it creates the ideal citizen for a debt-driven system, always consuming, never content, and perpetually chasing security that remains just out of reach. That's how inflation becomes culture. We call it economic growth. We call it progress. But underneath, it's the same mechanism that's operated for centuries, a continuous cycle of devaluation, reinflation, and rediscovery. It keeps governments solvent, banks liquid, and populations compliant. And once you recognize it, you can never ignore it again. Inflation didn't emerge from nowhere. It's the inevitable result of a world that demands everything immediately and finances it tomorrow. It's the quiet engine of debt, the fuel of nations, the lifeblood of a system that must perpetually expand, even when it crushes the people within it. And yet, here's the paradox. Without inflation, everything collapses. Deflation destroys borrowers, crashes financial institutions, and freezes commerce. Inflation keeps the mechanism running, regardless of who gets ground up in the process. That's the moral calculation of our economic system. Expansion at any cost. So the next time someone tells you that a little inflation is healthy for the economy, remember who benefits. Not the worker saving for a down payment, not the retiree on a fixed pension, but the ones who already own the property, the ones who designed the system to ensure it never stops appreciating.